October 23rd, 2001. Steve Jobs stands on a small stage in Cupertino and holds up a white plastic rectangle the size of a deck of cards. 1,000 songs in your pocket, 5 gigabytes, $399. A product so simple that it made every other portable music player feel unfinished. 9 years earlier, Sony had already built many of the pieces Apple would need. A pocketable digital music format, a compression system designed for portable audio, and the Walkman legacy, the strongest portable music brand on earth. Sony didn't lose the digital music war because it lacked the technology. It lost because Apple removed the friction Sony kept building back in. Launched in Japan in September 1992, the MiniDisc was, on paper, one of the most advanced consumer audio formats of its time. It used magneto-optical recording packed into a 2.5-inch disc housed inside a rigid plastic caddy. In practice, it felt less like a CD and more like a tiny futuristic cartridge. That caddy mattered. No fingerprints, no dust, no accidental scratches across the playing surface. You could throw a mini-disc into a bag in a way you would never treat a bare CD. It was built for motion, for pockets, for trains, for walking through a city with music that did not skip every time your shoulder hit someone on the sidewalk. The real technical breakthrough was ATTRAC, short for Adaptive Transform Acoustic Coding, Sony's in-house audio compression system. 8-track made it possible to fit around the length of an album onto a disc far smaller than a CD while keeping the sound close enough to CD quality for ordinary listeners. Audiophiles argued about it, and they had reasons to. But for most people, the point was not theoretical perfection. The point was that it worked. It sounded good, it was portable, and it solved problems people actually had. MiniDisc was also built around something CDs were terrible at: editing. You could rename tracks, reorder them, split one recording into two, erase one song without touching the rest of the disc, and do all of it from the device itself. No computer required. A cassette could record, but editing tape was clumsy. A CD could sound clean, but it was fixed. MiniDisc sat in the middle. It had the flexibility of tape and the convenience of digital access. And it was rewritable, thousands of times over. At a moment when consumer CD recording was still expensive, awkward, and far from normal in most households, MiniDisc let ordinary people record, erase, rearrange, and reuse their music in a way that felt genuinely ahead of the market. Sony had built a format that was smaller, tougher, and more flexible than the CD it was meant to challenge. The question was not whether the product had good ideas. The question was whether the world around it and Sony itself would let those ideas win. To understand what MiniDisc was up against, you have to understand 1992. The compact disc had launched a decade earlier, in 1982, and by the early 90s it had already become the dominant music format in many major markets. Record labels had invested heavily in CD manufacturing. Retail stores had rebuilt their shelves around it. Millions of listeners had already replaced parts of their vinyl and cassette collections with shiny new discs. Asking them to switch again was not a small request. It meant asking consumers to believe that the future they had just bought was already outdated. Sony was not alone in trying to create that next format. Philips, one of the co-inventors of the CD, launched the digital compact cassette in the same era, a format designed to feel familiar to people who still understood tapes. Both companies saw the same opening. CDs were clean, but they were not ideal for portable recording. They were fragile, relatively large, and in the early 90s, not easily rewritable for the average consumer. Sony's answer was MiniDisc. Philips had familiarity. Sony had something more powerful, the Walkman legacy. Since 1979, Sony had been the company that taught the world what portable music felt like. It made the players, the chips, the discs, and after acquiring CBS Records in 1988, Sony also owned a major piece of the music business itself. In theory, no company was better positioned to push a new music format into the mainstream. In practice, that same structure would become MiniDisc's slowest acting poison. 4 problems compounding over a decade kept MiniDisc from becoming the future Sony imagined. None of them were simply about the hardware. The first was price. When MiniDisc arrived, it was expensive. Early portable recorders cost hundreds of dollars at a time when portable CD players were becoming cheaper and more familiar. Blank MiniDiscs also cost enough that the format did not feel disposable. Sony was asking consumers to pay a premium for a better experience before most of them understood why they needed that experience in the first place. Prices eventually fell, but consumer technology does not wait politely for a company to get the timing right. By the time MiniDisc became more affordable, the next wave was already forming. MP3s, personal computers, cheaper storage, and internet file sharing were beginning to change what people thought music was. Not a disc, not a cartridge, a file. The second problem was ATTRAC. The compression system made MiniDisc possible, but it also kept the experience inside Sony's world. Other companies did make MiniDisc hardware, but the broader digital music ecosystem around ATTRAC never became as open, searchable, and frictionless as MP3. MP3 was messy, it was often lower quality. It was tied to piracy, sketchy downloads, and badly named files, but it moved easily. It could live on a computer, jump to a player, get copied, renamed, backed up, and shared. By the time listeners learnt to think of music as files instead of albums, Sony was still asking them to think in Sony's format. The third problem was the label gap. In Japan, MiniDisc became a real consumer format. In the West, it never received the same level of support. Pre-recorded MiniDisc albums existed, but they never became common enough to make the average shopper feel like the format was inevitable. In many places, MiniDisc survived less as a replacement for CDs and more as a recording tool. You used it to record from the radio, copy your own CDs, make mixes, or capture audio in the field. That gave the format a loyal audience, but not a mass market. It created a loop Sony could never fully break. Consumers hesitated because the albums were not widely available. Labels hesitated because consumers were not buying the format in large enough numbers. And while that loop continued, the CD kept its shelf space. But the most important problem came later when Sony finally had a chance to answer the MP3 player. By 2001, Sony introduced NetMD, which allowed users to transfer digital audio from a computer onto a mini-disc over USB. On paper, this should have been the bridge between the mini-disc world and the file-based future. It arrived in the same year as the iPod, but Sony wrapped the experience in OpenMG, a digital rights management system that made moving music feel less like ownership and more like asking permission. The problem was not that Sony could not build a good portable music device, it was that Sony could not decide what it was more afraid of, losing the hardware market or making music too easy to copy. Sony Electronics wanted to sell devices people loved using. Sony Music wanted to protect content. Both instincts made sense inside the company, but together they created friction at exactly the moment the market was moving towards simplicity. Apple did not have that internal conflict. Apple did not own a major record label. It did not need to protect a catalog from its own customers. Its incentive was cleaner: make the device easy, make the software simple, and make the whole experience feel obvious. The iPod was not the first portable digital music player, and it was not magic. But it removed obstacles. Sony kept adding them back. That is the deeper lesson of MiniDisc. A company divided against itself can lose to a company with less experience, less history, and even less technical originality, simply because the second company has one clear incentive and the first company has two competing ones. Away from the consumer format war, MiniDisc quietly won a different kind of respect. Through the late 90s and into the 2000s, it became a trusted tool for radio journalists, student broadcasters, field recordists, and audio professionals. They used Sony, Sharp, and other MiniDisc recorders because the format did exactly what they needed. It was compact, it was durable, it had clean digital recording, It allowed instant track marking. It did not have tape hiss. It did not require changing reels. And in many cases, you could organize recordings before you even got back to the studio. For professionals, MiniDisc became something that the consumer market never fully allowed it to be, the obvious tool for the job. These users were not trying to win a format war. They were choosing the thing that worked. That may be the most honest verdict any technology can receive. MiniDisc never fully disappeared. Sony sold its last MiniDisc hardware in Japan in 2013, more than 2 decades after the format launched. Since then, a collector market has grown around it, driven by nostalgia, by the physical beauty of the objects, by the appeal of owning music in a small cartridge, and by communities that still enjoy using technology that feels deliberate instead of invisible. Working MiniDisc players and sealed blank discs now trade in active collector markets, often for prices that make the format feel less like obsolete media and more like a boutique object. The format found, decades late, the audience willing to treat it as something special. MiniDisc was not a failed idea, it was a good idea trapped inside a company that could not decide which part of itself it was trying to protect. The engineering team built something genuinely ahead of the CD in portability, durability, recording and editing. The rights management side of the company helped create the friction that kept it from reaching the audience the engineers had earned. This is not a uniquely Sony problem, and it did not end in 2001. The same pattern appears whenever a company owns both a platform and something that platform might disrupt. Cable providers were slow to embrace streaming because streaming threatened the bundle. Camera makers were slow to understand computational photography because phones threatened the camera business. Publishers often resisted digital formats because digital formats threatened the margins of print. The best product a company can build is sometimes the one its own balance sheet will not let it ship. The market does not always reward the better engineering, it rewards whoever removes the most friction between the customer and the thing they want. Sony built the better disc. Apple built the fewer obstacles. Only one of those companies went on to define the era. MiniDisc is a small format with a large lesson. The companies best positioned to invent the future are often the ones most structurally incentivized to slow it down. Sony had the engineers, the brand, and a decade's head start. What it did not have was internal agreement on what the future should be allowed to look like. If this kind of story interests you, a company with every advantage undone by its own org chart, subscribe, because next week's video covers the beautiful smartphone operating system Microsoft built too late and why being right was not enough to save Windows Phone.